Hello everyone. Welcome to today's Procurement Officers webinar. I am your moderator Subhro Sen. Thank you for joining us. Our today's presenter, Donald Clark, is a senior global procurement and supply chain executive with over 30 years of international and domestic experience with major multinational consumer products corporations. After retiring from Colgate-Palmolive, he decided to pursue a second career in teaching. He is currently a professor of supply chain management at Rutgers University Business School. Donald holds an MBA from University of Rochester in operations management and BS from Clarkson University in engineering and management. In 2014, he received Procurement Leader's Lifetime Achievement Award, recognizing him for both his business and academic contributions. Today's Procurement Officers is an opportunity for us to start a dialogue and solicit some of your top-of-mind questions around the topic, shifting focus from cost to value, designing procurement goals or KPIs for the digital age. Our speaker, Donald Clark, has taken the time out of his busy schedule to address few of these burning questions that we received from you and your procurement peers. With that, I now turn over to Donald for answering the questions.
Okay, thanks, Subhro. Okay, so we've got a number of questions that you have previously submitted, and I believe there's an opportunity that the people that are on the call, they can submit other questions that we'll answer at the end of the previously submitted questions in the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx event. What I'm going to do is walk through probably about 10 questions, and then we'll see if there's any other questions, and then we'll do just a quick wrap-up. So hopefully everybody is going to have, welcome everybody, and I wish everybody a happy holiday and Merry Christmas wherever you are in the world. And so let's go ahead and get started. There's a bunch of questions around the setting of KPIs, or most people I'm sure on the call are familiar with it. That's key performance indicators. Some people call it objectives, and there's a couple other words that people use, but basically it's about setting up criteria to judge and measure your success and create the right behavior. So the first question that came in was, what exactly do you mean by shifting focus from cost to value? Can you give me some examples of value? I think everybody knows that that there really are two ways to create value in a business, to create shareholder value. One I know you're all familiar with is just reducing the unit cost. So we're not going to spend any time talking about that. But the two ways you can create value, one of them is increasing revenue, obviously, and the second one is to reduce cost. Now you can do that through the direct part of cost. I'm going to actually cover some other ones that you may not think about, that are kind of the indirect costs that you can reduce. So let me start, what probably one of the most important that many people don't really think about is the whole area of increasing revenue. And you say, well, geez, I work in procurement. You know, how the heck do I do that? Well, there's lots of ways you can do it. And you can actually put KPIs around this. I'm not suggesting that you do all of these. I think you have to do what's important for your business. The first one is supplier innovation. We deal with our suppliers day in, day out. Many times we spend way too much time focusing on cost. It certainly is important. But we also could ask our suppliers on a regular basis, or selected suppliers, do you have any innovation that will help us grow the top line? A good example, I think, is P&G Swifter. If you're familiar with it, that's the floor tool that you go around and you pick up the dust and dirt off your floors. That was actually developed by an outside supplier. And so so they actually brought it in, and you could, if you in procurement brought that supplier in, or had a supplier bring ideas in, you could keep track of those dollars and remind management that you don't only focus on cost, you also focus on innovation. The second one in this area, which we don't think about, is the whole idea of speed to market. If we can get our suppliers to deliver goods to make the final product quicker, thereby our products would be in the marketplace quicker, thereby increasing revenue. This also can be a competitive advantage by getting in the market quicker. Another one which we do all the time, but we never really get a lot of credit for it, is what about the times when we're going to manufacture products out of our existing markets and we have to go to a brand new market, and they come to procurement and they say, You know, we really need to have new suppliers in the market. It's too far to ship from the existing market, et cetera, et cetera. Well, one would argue that we're enabling or helping increase revenues by getting that good supply base to give us value. Another one would be contract manufacturing. Sometimes you can't do it on your own part, and you would have contract manufacturing. And a good example, which we don't think much about, is what about generally when you do special packs, which at least in consumer products is very prevalent. Those are the ones that are kind of up by the cash register. You know, we help develop that. Thereby, that's incremental sales, and therefore we help do that. What about negotiating in the contracts that you do about intellectual property? Do we think about, you know, can we get access and get ownership to intellectual property that might increase sales or give us a competitive advantage? And lastly, one which is kind of interrelated to cost, but it's not always, is do we really facilitate the use of getting suppliers in early? We call it early supplier involvement, or ESI. It's proven through the research, both in world-class performers and around other things, that when you have early supplier involvement, you will typically do many of the above things that we talked about. You'll have supplier innovation, you'll have speed to market, and, of course, lower cost. So this is just a list. But what I would encourage you to think about is that why not start capturing that and then be able to highlight that when you're talking to senior management about how you help facilitate, or actually, in the case of supplier innovation, we actually gave the business increased revenue. The second question is around these. You know, these are all good areas, but from my experience, it's very difficult to develop, measure, and track value-oriented KPIs. I think that's true. However, let's stop and just think about a few of the examples that we talked about. I mean, obviously, if you're in a company and you're launching a new product, or your supplier has given you innovation that helps the product, we typically track that. Most senior management get daily sales reports. There's no reason that we can't get access to those reports and be able to, you know, to track those type of values. So I think it can be done, and it's not as difficult as you think. We just don't typically think about it. So you could, even on things like speed to market, you could argue the earlier it got into market, the more incremental sales, and we could kind of track those types of things. And so you get my point. I think it's probably worth mentioning here maybe some of the other areas that create value before we jump into the next question. But we many times don't think about what we call the non-direct costs. Those are the unit costs that you either negotiate on the direct raw materials and packaging, or maybe on the indirect materials. And all these things also create value, and they're all measurable. So let me run through a couple of those to think about. So let's assume that you bring in a better supplier that improves quality. And you say, great, I did that. Well, if it has improved quality, basically you're going to lower your manufacturing costs. So why not get credit for that? What about if your suppliers you know, are erratic in their deliveries, and you get better suppliers to create on-time delivery? Isn't that going to lower manufacturing costs? Difficult to measure, but can be done. One that we don't talk about a lot about, but it's very prevalent today, is what about cash flow? I'm sure many of you have been asked to, for example, to extend payment terms. Well, if we do, that means we're contributing to cash flow, and why we can easily calculate what that's worth to the business. It's not a direct cost, it's an indirect cost, but having said it, it's a cost to the business. And as you probably know, many times your senior management is in front of the shareholders or the owners of the business worrying about cash flow, and you can say, I contributed to that. A part of reducing cash flow can be reducing inventory. So an example would be when I was at Colgate, we had a very big initiative to put all our suppliers up where we could in the world on supplier managed inventories. And in the United States, for example, it was in excess of 85% of our suppliers on supplier managed inventory. We took all that inventory off the books. So why wouldn't we want to get credit for that in the cash flow? And there's other examples that we can talk about, but I think you get the point. is that I think you stop and think about it, you can measure all of these, and they may not be perfect, but many of the ones I mentioned you can easily measure and determine the real value. Third question up is that is the whole area around all my senior management cares about cost. And how can I get buy-in for these value areas? Well, I'll tell you from my business career that many times the CEO or the president would come up to me and say, Don, you know, have you hit your cost savings? And you know, we always know these numbers and say, oh yes, you know, we're 85% there, or we saved you know, $6 million here or there. But we never stop and say, oh, by the way, did you know that our supplier innovation created $100 million of incremental sales? Or did you know that that last supplier that we brought in manufacturing created higher quality and thereby reduced waste in our manufacturing facilities that reduced the manufacturing cost indirectly by $6 million? And by the way, you know, those in the technology area, you know that by having better quality, we have less warranty issues, and we reduce the warranty costs by another $1.5 million. And I think we need to be comfortable in bringing those things up. And I can tell you from my experience, generally senior management does only care about cost, but it's our job as leadership to stop them and say, you know, there are some other things we're doing. Well, the second point about senior management, how to get buy-in, and Colgate was very good at this when I was there, is that you have to tie your goals directly to senior management goals. So where you need to start, particularly in leadership roles, is to say, what does senior management care about? Well, certainly about cost, because that's going to increase gross margin. We know that. So you want to tie that. Maybe they have an objective in gross margin. So you want to tie those savings into gross margin, and you can show that that directly increases gross margin. Thereby, the business can turn around and reinvest it. But what about some of these value things, right? Well, senior management's worried about growth. So you could say, we're going to contribute next year by supplier innovation somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 million worth of incremental sales to the business. So you want to make sure you tie in. Cash flow is always usually on senior management. We contributed X amount of dollars to cash flow. So I always tell people the way you need to start, it has to be bottom down first. That's where you start. So go, rather than just not being worried so much about what do we want to have KPIs for within our procurement. I think we certainly want to develop that, but you also want to start, what does senior management want, and have a dialogue with them. And then say, I think I can contribute to these KPIs that you have by us doing the following things. And sure, you're going to have some local KPIs, you know, that probably they're not as interested in, but you can hold those locally. So I think it's very important to show the direct link from your KPIs to senior management KPIs. It won't be 100%, but it'll be many of them. So I think it's important if you want to get buy-in, you have to show senior management. And you should probably show senior management your KPIs and ask the question, what do you think about these? Now, he might say, you know, some of these aren't really important to me, and but if they're important to you, go ahead and track them. So I think there's a real opportunity to engage senior management in the process, and thereby having better alignment. And I think if you do those two things about reminding them that you do more than cost, and you actually get buy-in to their KPIs, I think you go a long way to showing them that you can do more than just worry about cost. The fourth question, it's good. This is a very good one. It says, at the end of the day, people make KPIs happen. What do we need to do differently in our talent strategy to make this happen? I do a lot of work in the talent area, so I'll give you just a couple of indicators. But first, I would say one of the most important things that leadership needs to do from a KPI standpoint is to really set the expectation, right? And so the leader has to say, this is what I need you to deliver. There has to be regular reviews of those KPIs, not just at performance, you know, management time, annually. It has to be done on a regular basis. And I think it has to set the expectation that if you're doing well, you get a pat on the back on a regular basis. And if you need help, get some help to get your KPIs to make it happen. Now, as far as the talent, many of you probably know you're out searching for people. Particularly in the United States, in many parts of the rest of the world, there's real talent shortages out there. About 10,000 baby boomers like myself are retiring every day, and there's just not enough people coming up in the business world to replace them. And it's nothing to do with other than demographics. There just isn't enough millennials, Gen Y, Gen X's, and Gen Z's to replace them. So what do you need to do? Well, first of all, you got to make talent a very big priority, and you got to make sure you get the talent in. And I have a separate, presentation and discussion, so you can email me if you want to see it. But you got to get that talent in order to make KPIs handle. So just getting the people in is most important. And having said that, I think we need to think a lot about. I know the exact year, but I believe millennials will make up probably somewhere around 50% of the workforce by 2020, which is quite frankly not far away. Now these millennials are different. Many are on the call here, and the one thing that they are very good, they're curious, and they're very linked to technology. So we're going to talk about technology in the second set of questions, but these are the people that probably might do better implementing some new technology versus, I hate to say it, some old baby boomers like me. That's a joke for baby boomers, but the point would be is why not leverage their talents, right? If they're good at technology and communicating and other things, they're probably great to put on these projects to go ahead and manage the projects around this type of thing. And they're going to be our future anyway, so we got to use them, right? So the two things in talent is you got to be out there aggressively getting talent because there's not enough people, and secondly, what do you do once you have them, right? The way you hire them or whatever. So this is a big problem, and I'm sure many of you are out there looking for people, and it's very difficult. I have people telling me that some of these openings are opening for 3 to 6 months. They can't find anybody, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an overall bigger problem, but it does affect getting your KPIs. Question number 5 is that, and this is another good question. He said, what are the goals and KPIs relevant to the indirect procurement that are focused on supporting business priorities? So I'm sure everybody knows indirects is everything that doesn't go into the cost of goods sold. So this can be anywhere from advertising to print material to temporary labor to cafeteria services or whatever. And it is very different, but in many respects it's the same. And I think that just to stop and think about it, many of the indirects, probably senior management is not all that engaged. I'll give you some examples that they might be engaged in. So probably in this case, you particularly, again, linking what you want to do in indirects, it's probably could be in senior management, but probably most likely it has to probably a stakeholder in the business, a vice president of marketing is probably more engaged. So you want to make sure that you engage him in those KPIs. So what do I mean about creating value? So an example might be, let's say, print materials in marketing. Usually most firms have large expenditures in print materials. So, it could be that the company cares about this on the senior management, the president, but most likely it's the VP of marketing. And let's say he has bad quality. And he's complaining about, the suppliers he has, they can't get the stuff. It seems to be printed and all that kind of stuff. So you could argue that if you bring in the better quality, maybe on time, quicker, or whatever, you can create value for him other than just cost. So in your strategic sourcing process, this would be a key criteria to get better printers or more responsive printers. Another example in indirects, let's just say cleaning services. Now it's possible, let's say you're in a hospital, and it's possible that the people that run the hospitals, obviously it's the most important thing in a hospital is to be clean. And maybe they're dissatisfied with the current suppliers in that area. So it might be a senior management objective, but most likely it's probably somebody that runs administration or whatever. And you're going to bring in better suppliers or more frequent cleaning, or maybe they have some value activities where they do other things in cleaning. Maybe they do laundry or whatever. Who knows what it is? But you would make the case that in addition to having a good, optimal cost supplier, you're creating value by having that hospital cleaner that maybe might be able to have more people visit the hospital. A third one I thought about, would be travel. In my case, when I was in Mars, I had the travel agency reporting to us. Good news, bad news. You get all the complaints from the people that didn't get the seat they wanted. But anyway, the thing that was interesting in there is that, yes, we had a good provider that provided travel services, but we did research and found that one of the reasons travel costs were too high is people were booking plane tickets at the last minute, which, as we all know, the fare is higher. So we put a policy in place where we literally, said if you book, 3 days or earlier, or, within 3 days, you're going to get an memo to your boss saying you're not planning your trips properly. That creates value, lowers costs, and I think it puts the right message in the business about the travel department. So, it is, I think the bottom line on this one is that it certainly is different, but in many respects it's the same. You got to link those KPIs to senior management, probably the senior indirect category area, but many of the same things can be tracked. The sixth question in this is, what are the key indicators today of CPOs are focusing on? Certainly, whether you like it or not, they still have their responsibility for cost. I don't think that's going to change. But I think what I see happening, at least from my vantage point, is that many of the CPOs are saying exactly what we're talking about. They're saying we can do more than reduce cost. We create value. We've already talked about those types of things. We can bring more than just cost reduction to the table. And we want to expand our role, I think is what CPOs are saying, and we can create values in other areas. What do I mean by that? Well, we should be on a team when we do mergers and acquisitions. Why? Because we have our contracts, the emerging company has their contracts. We can see who has the best contracts and quickly implement it in order to help pay off that very large expenditure of the merger and acquisition, right? Integration of the business tends to be important. If you're going to get a seat at the table or you're going to keep the seat at the table, integrating into the business better than you had before versus being a standalone department, and establishing KPIs around it. What I mean by that, if you're working in a supply chain, your KPIs have to link directly into, at least in direct materials, some indirect materials, but have to be linked directly to the supply chain. So I work for a senior VP in supply chain. We're on his staff. We linked our KPIs to support supply chain, and he linked many of those KPIs to support the business. The newer areas, as we mentioned, I think cash flow is a hot button, particularly in today's environment, particularly during the recession. Risk management, really big today. Why? Well, quite frankly, mostly due to people that are global. Everything gets riskier, and unfortunately, whether you like it or not today, 24/7 news coverage. These things pop up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, 2 hours after they happen. So risk management is a big deal. I'll talk a little bit on that in a minute, but I think risk management typically is one that is hot and that they're doing business. Now you come back and you might say on risk management, well, how do I rate that, right? Well, if you're reviewing your key suppliers, I'm sure you're putting in some sort of matrix that says, that these problems are, these red suppliers have got big problems. You would actually keep track of how many people that, say you have a stoplight where you have red, yellow, green, and these red suppliers have action plans and contingency plans against them in order to hopefully mitigate the risk. Well, you might track the number of those suppliers and how many of those people move to the yellow and green area. And there's all sorts of tools out there. I won't spend time today, but there are all sorts of tools out there that can help you do it. There's actually rating systems. I saw one, I think it was from IBM, that has a numerical rating system that rates financial and number of hits on the internet and you know, other things, you know, weather and other things that gives you a rating that you can point to say that we're getting better or worse in risk management. So I think, you know, there's lots of things going here, but particularly on risk management, I would say that's probably a hot one today. The last question in this one about setting KPIs is that are we saying that supplier KPIs attribute should remove the cost as an assessment factor? It's funny you brought this up. There was a recent article by one company in the last couple of weeks about how we really don't need to look at cost. We just need to look at, you know, how we integrate in the business, and that may be true for this particular company. My answer to this is no. We are responsible for cost in the corporation. I don't know many people that are. A little bit in supply chain, certainly not the stakeholders and indirects many times. So I guess I would say is that the answer is no as far as my thing. But I think what we can do is to move to cost and value, right? And I think that if we just kind of say the costs aren't that important, I think we're taking a big piece away from it. And I'm sure there are exceptions that people want to only look at the value, but I haven't found them in 38 years of business and you know, 10 years almost of teaching that cost is ever not a factor in the assessment. So I'm sure there's some people that want to debate that with me, but I guess I would say basically that the answer is no to this question. Okay, well, I've got one more here, I think. Okay, now we're going to jump into leveraging technology to create value. So the first half was really about setting objectives, and the next set of questions are going to be around leveraging technology. So the first question is, what is the role of leveraging digital platforms to help achieve value KPIs? There's a couple questions around this, so I'm going to cover it twice, I believe, in the questions. So let's just take one, for example, on this list here. And we talked about risk management a little bit. But let's take source to pay, or some people call it procurement to pay, S to P. And the question is why you use S to P, right? And source to pay. Why is that important? And should you measure it? Yeah, I think you should measure it. I'm not sure it's going to come up on the radar screen of senior management, but I think it's very important. And I would think the most important reason you want to do it is obviously making sure people are using it. That's always important. But more importantly, this is about efficiency of your department and organization. And more importantly, the more efficient you are in processing source to pay, it'll allow you more time to be able to work on these value KPIs that we talked about. So I'm not saying you shouldn't measure it. I don't think it's going to come up unless it's very important in senior management. It might, but it is important probably for your group to measure how well source to pay is working and making sure you're not having people non-conformists and not using it, et cetera, et cetera. The real reason source to pay is important is information. So let me give you an example from my business career. So we got involved in, when I was at Colgate in going after indirects in a big way. We put in a source to pay. And what we really needed to do is to be able to use that to capture information to be able to understand the spend in a lot of these areas. And as you're well aware, that's a big job, but in order, you have to clean up the data. You got to make sure it's being put in the right category, it has the right cost code. Even simple things like suppliers, you know, is it IBM or is it International Business Machine or is it in a foreign language? All those things have to be cleaned up on the indirect side. And assuming you do that and get good data, then you can leverage the information to strategically source and create value for the organization. So I think it's important. We have another question on digital in a minute. I'll go a little deeper into some of these things. But I think it's very important to Obviously track it and keep track of it, but it's probably a local thing, maybe between you and finance, but probably it might hit the radar screen of your president, but I highly doubt it. Okay, next one is a little deeper question. This is our company is digitally challenged and would be terrific to be able to bring technology into our KPI tracking. Data collection for KPI tracking is challenging. Any suggestions? Yeah, a couple of ones here. I understand that many companies may not have robust systems to do this. The first suggestion I'd have would keep it small. You don't need to have 22 KPIs that you can't track. I think it's better to just highlight the important ones that's important to your business, hopefully linking it to senior management. And let's take a handful, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or something, and you can obviously track it. And the smaller it is, the easier it is to do manually. The second one, which should go for any KPI tracking, but particularly if you don't have the technology to do it, is work with your finance people to help you. There's 2 reasons for that. Number 1, they're good at it. 3 reasons. Number 2, if you get your finance people to track it, you have instant credibility that it's right. And number 3, it allows you to work on creating value for the company. So you want to link with finance, making sure that they're helping you. And the last thing I'd say is that there are you don't have to do the full suite of systems. Even at Zycus could probably help you in some of these areas, where maybe all you do is use their systems to, for example, keep track of categories or roll up categories of spend. That's it. Not source to pay, nothing. You just take some of the database, maybe either off your legacy systems or ERP system, and you analyze spend. So an example from my past would be, we did have SAP at Colgate. We used it, and obviously we did not have a source-to-pay system. We eventually put one in. We couldn't wait for that to run for a year or so and clean up all the data through source-to-pay. So we actually, I can't remember the exact company. We had a company come in that all they did was analyze the data dump off the ERP systems and put it in categories for us, and would look for name recognition, categories, whether it made sense it was going to these individual accounts, looking for names, kicking out appear to be exceptions, and that's all it was. And I can't remember exactly what it was or how much it cost, but what I do remember, it was really low price. So rather than standing back and say, well, I don't have any systems, maybe you buy a subset of that. And if you're going to these trade shows, et cetera, there are all sorts of people in these sales booths at these trade shows and procurement events selling these type of technology. So get out and find out about it and find out how much it costs. And certainly you can do it manually if you keep it simple. All right. So the 10th question is about artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning. It would be great if you can touch on your thoughts how the new digital technology will influence procurement. Example, automation of some of the processes leading to reduction of cost of running procurement, shift in headcounts to value-added activities. Certainly, as I said earlier, many of these technologies that, as I mentioned earlier, source to pay, artificial intelligence, and robotics process automation can all help create efficiencies for you and leverage data to buy better and hopefully keep track of value activities, have more time to do it. So these technologies are moving very quick in the area of artificial intelligence. You can do simple things like some sort of self-learning capability to categorize PO and invoices to line items, or putting it in the proper classification structures, segment or class or commodity. It can help guide requisitioners, like if you have a source-to-pay system, they're not sure what category they might be in, so it might help making sure they're maybe using existing contracts. It doesn't have to be manual. It can be done. And then lastly, can do just having suggestions about your contracts versus you pulling your contracts out and keeping, say, well, is this contract due and blah, blah, blah. Hey, look, you got a contract due in 3 months. T-sourcing takes 12 weeks. We better get started. This contract's going to expire, and it can save you time from doing it. All these things will support your overall KPIs because you won't be spending manual time basically tracking it and making it easier. Now, I'll tell you, it's probably not there 100%, but it's getting there very, very quickly. In the case of robotics process automation, again, happening very quickly. We see a lot of this, particularly in robotics and manufacturing and in warehousing. We don't see a lot of it in procurement, but it's coming very, very quickly. And, these types of systems, we tend to think it's a little, robot in the corner moving around, but it's really about these type of systems can actually, for example, if you have paper, if you're trying to go electronic and your suppliers aren't ready to go electronic and they're shipping paper, and you can have it particularly scan those documents and make it electronic until such time he comes up. Three-way matching is very well known, but again, you can have time saved by having people do three-way matching, and the bill just comes up, and if you own that source to pay, it'll be done quicker and you'll be more efficient. And just workflows, right? About, such things as maybe alerts, reminders, escalations, for example. Hey, you got a quality problem over here. Hey, you got a delivery problem, versus you trying to go into the system and say, gee, now, I've seen this, in the system that the supplier is running late. It can remind you. So I think there's a future here. And again, as I said earlier, all of this will give you greater visibility, and it will be faster. And it can even get to the point where it could be predictive that you have a problem coming. So I think it's an exciting area, and I think it's probably a good area to monitor. So I think with that, we have any other questions that anybody would like answered?
Michael, Donald, we have a new question from Michael.
Okay.
So the question is, sourcing and procurement professionals often do things that manage and mitigate various kinds of risk. Since there isn't a precisely correlated cost savings, how do we associate financial contribution to risk management?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, tough one. But the way I used to do it when people say, and this is a soft answer, so I do apologize, Michael. The first thing to say is people say, why are you spending so much time on risk management? You ought to have it in your hip pocket to say, when we didn't do it last year, you might remember that we had to write down $22 million worth of stuff because we had a bad supplier. Or you remember that child labor problem we had in Asia, for example, was on the front page, and that hurt our sales for a couple of days until we could fix it. There are I've seen some people trying to associate probabilities with risk activities, and thereby, if you know the probability, you could probably estimate the cost. It's a little too fancy for me, Michael, but certainly could be done. Who does this? Your insurance people, right? They somehow estimate what when at risky situations. So you might, in selected circumstances, go to your risk management people and say, in your experience, that when we don't have risk management, when we don't do these kind of things, what type of risk do you see out there, and what's the probability of that risk? And as you're probably well aware, they have the answer, and the reason they have the answer is because they're the ones writing the insurances, right? They have to know it. And so it's not a perfect answer. I do agree with it. It's very difficult. But those kind of things, I think, can help do it. And, of course, after it happens, nobody wants to remember those conversations. But I think it's important, at least if you set it up front, you'd say, remember that conversation we had last month about if we didn't do this, what might happen? So it's a soft answer, but I think it's as close as you can get.
Great. So we haven't...
Go ahead.
Yeah, so we don't have any other questions. So do you have any other comments that you want to share with the audience, Donald?
Yeah, I thought I'd just come back with a, kind of a roadmap in this area going forward to create value, and 4 or 5 summary points. And first of all, you have my contact information here, so you certainly can email me if you want, and I'll be happy to answer it if I can. The first thing on the roadmap forward to create value is that I think we got to admit, one of the people previously asked the question is, we're going to always be responsible for costs. I think it's probably, you just have to acknowledge that we got to be good at it. That's what gets us the entry into sitting at the table and having other areas of value. If we don't do that well, it's going to be hard to make the point on that. So as just a mandate to say we have to do cost well. The second thing is that we need to remind senior management when it occurs. So they'll come up to you and say, how's your cost savings program going? This used to happen all the time at Colgate, all the time. And you got to tell them, you got to be very succinct, and you got to say you know what you know, and then you got to use the and question. And you know that we have created value other than cost in these areas. Be very specific, so they understand you do it, and they'll thank you, and I'm sure they'll give you a big raise. We didn't talk a lot about setting up the KPIs, but it's really got to be challenge yourself to make sure it's clear, measurable. People that know the SMART objective setting, which is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time. Make sure it's really good, because if you're going to judge people, it's good, and if it's not, I think it will hurt your credibility. I talked about limiting, particularly if you don't have the technology. Somebody asked a question about being digitally challenged. Start small, and then you're going to grow. And over time, you can add other KPIs or whatever. You don't have to have 20 KPIs. I wouldn't recommend it. I'd recommend 3 or 4 to start. Just limit your KPIs and make sure they're effective, and move forward. And then lastly, I've said this before, is that don't do your KPIs in a vacuum. Start with senior management KPIs. Make up KPIs that support those senior management objectives. That's how you'll be seen in the organization as being engaged in the business. You'll certainly have some KPIs that are local within your procurement group, but that's just for the procurement group. And I think for the business, you need to do that. And those KPIs that you're linking to business, obviously cost will be one of them, but hopefully you got 2 or 3 other ones that are talking about value. And if you do that, I think you'll be successful. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you and let you wrap up and go from there.
Yes, so thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, Donald, for sharing your huge knowledge. And I'm sure our audience have already found it really useful. We will be sharing the recording of this webinar within 24 hours in your registered email ID. Thanks again for joining us. Have a nice day.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great holiday.
Sure.